Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTrek 2021. This is a 5-month mission I'm on with a bunch of other booktubers, in which for the rest of the year we are reading Star Trek novels. Not the greatest literature ever to bolt out of the barn, but lots of fun. The good ones, anyway, and even the bad ones in their own way are lots of fun. And we are going franchise by franchise. So for August, we're doing the original series. Then September, we're doing The Next Generation. And then October, we'll do Deep Space Nine. Then November, Voyager, and then we'll finish out the year in December with Star Trek Enterprise. And Vin at Revenant Reads is our dauntless captain, and he noticed that I slacked off on making videos. I was going to make a video a day. I could easily make 5 videos a day about all things Star Trek. And he politely had a word with me. So I am back with another Star Trek video, and I want to comment a bit on an element that I brought up in an earlier Star Trek video, an earlier BookTrek video, which is that Star Trek, for the first time, a popular plastic media franchise, introduced the element of time to its canonical storyline, to its canonical world. Star Trek adventures are not just our original crew in their mid-30s, forever. That is not what's going to happen. This is not Batman. This is not Superman. This is time was introduced into Star Trek with Star Trek the Motion Picture. The first big screen Star Trek movie, the one that was the biggest gamble. The folks at Paramount had no idea if the fans of the syndicated TV show, the reruns, would show up for a movie, much less make it a success. Star Trek the Motion Picture was a financial success. And that was nothing compared to what was coming. Good Lord, what was coming was Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, was a wildly more popular movie than Star Trek the Motion Picture for obvious reasons, many, many obvious reasons. And the movies just kept making money. And they spawned TV shows that made more money with tons of toys, tons of models, tons of collectibles, tons of syndication deals. But in Star Trek the Motion Picture, we didn't know that. It wasn't known that it would be successful. But Star Trek the Motion Picture introduces the element of time. It need not have. I don't know if I in the 21st century loves all sorts of realistic serialized storytelling. So in that ways, it's much more advanced than the storytelling of the time that I'm talking about. So I don't know that it'd be really clear if the 21st century storytelling is all that you're really familiar with. But Star Trek the Motion Picture could easily have been an episode in the original 5-year mission. Could easily have been that. And either recast all of the original characters or just had the original characters on there and said nothing about it. Could be maybe a tossed off line. Maybe Bones says a tossed off line about how they renewed our commission. We're on our second 5-year mission. You wouldn't need anything more than that. Willing suspension of disbelief definitely applies when it comes to movies. Fans would have swallowed it. But instead, time has passed. Kirk is an admiral. Our crew has scattered to the 4 winds, and we don't know why. We don't learn anything about that intervening time period. When we last saw them on TV, they were in brightly colored costumes. They were in the middle of their 5-year mission, and they were just having an adventure every week. Suddenly, in Star Trek the Motion Picture, that's all different. Suddenly, it seems like we were dipping in on events in the lives of real people whose lives move on and who might not be exactly the same as when we left them. I always found that fascinating, but there's one thing about that kind of approach that you're going to run afoul of, and it's not unique to that, of course, because the same problem cropped up often in the original series, in the episodes of the original series that I know and love so well. But the movies really highlight it, which is consequences. You're going to develop all sorts of consequences that you don't have the time to deal with in a 2-hour movie. That was true of the original series. The original series would often open gigantic cans of worms and just leave them there. You think about an original series episode and how much a lot of them do. There are some that are worse than others. Some are fairly neatly wrapped up. But take, for instance, an episode. This is connected to our book today. Take, for instance, an episode called For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky. Starts off with McCoy telling Kirk that he has a fatal illness, and that he's not going to live long. Then they find a world ship, Yonada, It's a gigantic asteroid with impulse engines of its own, but it's so big, and it's been so carefully constructed as a generation ship that the people living on board it think it's a planet. They don't know that it's a ship, and the planet Yonata is governed by a tyrannical computer. A big fear in Roddenberry's day, because of these big boxy computers we were being told could easily replace humans at just about everything, and now they have. And now they have. I won't stress this too much, but if you go to a doctor's office, a scrub, a visiting intern will do the in-person examination. But what you don't see when they leave you is that they're consulting the web. They're consulting medical databases. The computer will determine. And let's not say anything about flying. Okay. You already know I'm not all that happy about flying anyway, but flying is entirely automated. Pilots don't do anything. Maybe they touch a few controls at takeoff and landing, but the plane does everything else. It'd be crazy for it not to. It's infinitely better. I'm amazed that the automotive industry in the world has not just become that way. I guess I'm not amazed because there's huge amounts of money involved, but there's a lot more money involved in lawsuits and payouts and settlements and whatnot. And automated cars, I know all the jokes about them, but they won't make the mistakes that humans do at all. Just last week or the week before that, I have a sort of a policy when it comes to cars. I am a lifelong pedestrian, and I'm almost always walking Her Highness there. So I'm not just that I'm walking, but that I have a dependent with me whose life means more to me than mine does. So a typical habit of mine is that I let cars go by. I wait until the road is empty before we cross. I don't accept the offer of some motorists who, although they have the right of way because they have the light, will slow to a stop in order to let me cross in front of them. I don't accept that offer. I understand that one time out of 10 it's done in good faith. It's done by a normal person who's not a nervous wreck or a rageaholic like what driving turns normal people into. But I don't want to risk it. The 9 other times out of 10, you're not in full possession of your faculties, but you are in full control of 2,000 pounds of metal. So I want you to be in my rearview mirror before I cross the road. So my habit is that I will just sort of smile and wave the person on. And just a couple of weeks ago, I saw a reaction, I've seen it before, where the driver of the car was so furious that I didn't accept their offer to let me walk in front of them, that they slammed their foot on the accelerator and accelerated from 0 to 70 as an expression of anger, usually with a hurled epithet out the window as they're passing me. And a couple of weeks ago, a driver did that, slammed his foot on the accelerator because I had politely said, no thanks, I'll wait. And he was so concentrated on his rage that he didn't notice that there was a truck 30 feet in front of him and rear-ended the truck, crushed the front of his truck, crushed the front of his car, badly dented the back of the truck. Nobody's hurt, nobody's bothered at all, but both of them had to get out of their cars, exchange insurance information, a cop had to come by, all because of that moment. So an automated car wouldn't do that. But anyway, the little plot description that I gave just then of "For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky" barely begins to scratch the surface of the episode. Kirk intervenes in Yonatan society. He destroys the computer that runs the world. He lets everybody know that they're on a world. He flagrantly violates the Prime Directive. And it turns out that in the vast databases of the Fabrini people on Yonata lies the cure to McCoy's illness. And by extension, the cure to all sorts of there's a vast trove of biomedical information that will take a long time to decipher, but that will change all of Federation society. Do we ever hear anything more about it? No, we don't, of course, because the TV show has moved on. But the episode has consequences, huge consequences. The same thing is true overwhelmingly for the movies. Just think about the movies for a minute. The canonical original cast Star Trek movies. Just think about the movies. In Star Trek: The Voyage Home, Star Trek 4, the most popular Star Trek movie for the normal population. The population doesn't care much about Star Trek. In that movie, in order to save Earth from an interstellar probe, Kirk and his crew slingshot around a sun and go back in time to the 20th century to rescue a pair of humpback whales and bring them into the future. Kirk mentions as a tossed off line to repopulate the species. You can't do that with two individuals. But one way or another, I want you to think for a minute about that. Spock, who has only just recently regained his personhood, he was dead. his katra was stored in Dr. McCoy's body. In other words, he's not in top form, as is made clear in the course of that movie. He doesn't understand 1, 2, and 3. But he does mental calculations in order to make sure that slingshot effect around the sun works and brings them exactly to the point in time they want to go to. He doesn't use any databases that we can see, and they don't use the Enterprise, a state-of-the-art starship from Starfleet. Instead, they use a battered line of combat Klingon bird of prey. And it works. And it works. Think about that for a minute. If nothing else, if you think about nothing else, the probe that almost kills the Earth, the huge amounts of damage that must have been done before the whales are brought back, the fact that there are now 2 humpback whales in the oceans of the Earth. Aside from all that, time travel to a specific moment in time is eminently possible now. Literally anybody can do it. You don't need a computer bank, you just need a really smart person. And the smart person doesn't even have to be compos mentis. They can still do the calculations, in other words, are easy. And the technology involved is pretty much anything that's warp capable. Never dealt with again. Never dealt with again. And the same thing is true of Star Trek the Motion Picture, the first Star Trek movie, the big gamble on Paramount's part. Will these fans, these diehard people, filling hotel rooms and calling them conventions, watching endless reruns, buying all the books that we can shovel at them, will they pay out for a movie? Will they make a movie a success? The same thing is true for Star Trek the Motion Picture. Time has passed, but there are enormous consequences to that movie that are never dealt with. An object, the plot of Star Trek the Motion Picture is essentially the original series episode, The Changeling. Pretty much exactly. I mean, the one-to-one comparisons have been done before. The list is virtually endless. But an old Earth probe into space is modified by an alien race of sentient machines and sent across the galaxy, and apparently across time as well, eventually with the goal of coming back to Earth to merge with its creator. That is the original series episode with Jackson Roy Kirk. But the Kirk and crew are the only starship within range. They have to go and stop the thing, and they do it because Kirk's first officer, Matt Decker, whose starship, he was going to be in command of the Enterprise with a crew that he had hand-assembled, a totally redesigned ship. He was going to be in command of that vessel until Kirk took over because of Voxer, because of this impending threat. And at the end of the movie, Will Decker achieves the dream scenario of every college fraternity dude bro. He hooks up with a completely submissive android double of his old girlfriend. And they mate, but they also mate with Voxer, and the 3 of them combine to become this holy trinity that goes to other dimensions, that goes somewhere. I don't know where. I don't think the science is very clear in Star Trek the Motion Picture. And that's it. We're told at the end of the movie that the crew that has now been reassembled, including Mr. Spock, are all just going to go about their business. They're going to go back to being the ship that we knew in the original series. They're going to go back to having adventures. You know, that away. Let's go for a shakedown cruise. Let's go out and have adventures. With nary a backward glance as to any of the fallout from that movie. Huge amounts of fallout. Foremost of which is that Kirk has saved the world. Jim Kirk has saved the world. It's highly publicized that he takes over the Enterprise. It's well known what happens. But also, Mr. Spock had been pursuing the Kolinar ritual on Vulcan to purge all remaining emotions when he was telepathically contacted by Voxer. He mind melts with Voxer, and it radically reshapes his worldview. It changes the Mr. Spock that we knew into a Mr. Spock who is perfectly willing to embrace emotion. That's a huge change. Gigantic. Also, a little bit less theatrical than either of those, but equally telling, Bones McCoy retires from Starfleet. When we meet him, he's a bearded old rustic with a nice 1970s medallion. Hasn't been on board a starship in years. Has no idea what's happening in sickbay. His nurse, Christine Chapel, is now a doctor. He's brought on to outrank her. I hear Chapel's an MD now. I'm going to need a top nurse, not a doctor who'll quibble every diagnosis with me. No mention is made about what Christine Chapel thinks of that, but also things change. A lot of things change, and McCoy's been out of the loop. How effective will he be as chief medical officer on board the USS Enterprise? And so on and so forth. That movie has a huge amount of fallout that is never looked at, never glanced at or mentioned in any other movie. And that's where Star Trek fiction comes in. Bet you thought I forgot about Star Trek fiction, because here I am going on and on. I'm waffling on and on about Star Trek movies. We should do that. We should have a Zoom chat where my hosts and I talk about Star Trek movies. But in the meantime, I picked a book for today that is by Christopher Bennett, and it's Ex Machina. As you can tell right away from the new skinny nacelles and from the look of these photos, this is set in the era of Star Trek the Motion Picture. The uniforms changed for Star Trek 2, and they stay changed from then on. This is the only time we see these pajama uniforms. They also very much signal it with the font for the original Star Trek movie. And this is Christopher Bennett writing that fallout. This novel is about that fallout. That's all that this is. There is a story involving the world ship Yonada. And there is a story that wraps up the fallout of For the World is Hollow and I Have Touched the Sky. But mainly, the main thrust of this book is to wrap up Star Trek the Motion Picture. This gives us a Kirk who has suddenly realized that he is a world celebrity. He is not a normal person anymore. He's not a high-ranking Starfleet officer anymore. He's a world hero. He saved the world. Here we have a Spock who smiles and jokes and has a very unsettled relationship with his revived emotions. Here we have a McCoy who realizes that he doesn't know the first thing about half the new alien species that are on the Enterprise as crew members. An alien, inclusive, a multi-species crew that was assembled by Matt Decker, and many of whom are loyal to him, and we get a lot of that in this. That crew would be loyal to their captain, the person they were going to have 5 years of adventures with. And maybe even some of them think that Kirk killed him. You don't get any of that in the movies. In fact, the movies quickly do away with the crew just in general. They really want a starship that has only the main cast and not 430 other people. To the point where, I mean, don't get me wrong, Star Trek 3 is my favorite Star Trek movie. I absolutely love it. I know it backwards and forwards. And my favorite sequence in all of Star Trek, in any of Star Trek, is the stealing of the Enterprise from Star Trek 3, where our original crew, minus Spock, band together in order to steal the Enterprise from space dock in order to bring McCoy to Vulcan. They were refused permission from Starfleet, so they take it on their own shoulders to do it and demonstrate rather handily what the old Star Trek fans knew all along, which is this is not a crew that you want against you. They can do pretty much anything. And they do. I love that sequence. Absolutely love it. Mr. Scott has been made captain of the engineering section of the Excelsior, which has transwarp drive, and he has to both sabotage the Excelsior so that it can't chase the Enterprise, and also fully automate the Enterprise. Talk about unaddressed consequences. Kirk shows up on the darkened bridge of his old Enterprise and says, "Mr. Scott," and Scotty says, "She's all ready, sir. All fully automated. A chimpanzee and 2 trainees could run her." Kirk says, "Thank you, Mr. Scott. I'll try not to take that personally." And the audience chuckles rather than take in the point, which is that starships can be automated now. What? What? After all we've seen? After all the separate areas of command and control all throughout the ship? You can automate all of that? Well, if you can automate all of that, then what's the point of having 430 people go on this thing? It's in that one sentence of Star Trek 3 is the original episode, The Ultimate Computer. Only it's not the evil, coldly logical M5. Instead, it's Mr. Scott, who has put himself out of a job. He's never addressed again. It's either that you have some sort of perfunctory crew, like in the final in Star Trek: The Undiscovered Country, or it's like it's just assumed that you don't need a crew. One way or another, it's never addressed. The aftermath of that is never addressed. That you can automate a starship. One way or another, I love Star Trek 3. I think that it's a fantastic movie, but where was I going with that? I want to talk about Star Trek 3 so much. You have Scotty involved in this novel, but he's still torn between, being careful about his enterprise, which has not had a proper shakedown cruise, and being loyal to Jim Kirk. They actually have it out in this novel. And the Captain Kirk, the Admiral Kirk that we see in Star Trek: The Motion Picture is very much part of this book for probably half its length. The Admiral that we see in Star Trek: The Motion Picture is stiff. He's kind of impersonal with the crew. It kind of falls back on the formality of rank out of a little bit of insecurity. It's a very good performance by Shatner, but it's not the Captain Kirk that we knew. And it's not the Captain Kirk we want to know either. We don't want adventures with that kind of a captain. We're going to get 7 years of them with that kind of a captain with Star Trek: The Next Generation. But the plot that Christopher Bennett works up in this novel interweaves the story of V'ger, which now the whole galaxy knows, with the story of the settled people of Yonata. There's a separatist group of Yonatans who miss their old oracle. They miss their old world controlling computer, and they draw a link between that and V'ger, because in both cases Jim Kirk killed a god, and so they've got a little bit of a vendetta against him, and it comes at the worst possible time, because he's out of sync with his crew, he's out of sync with his ship, and he's out of sync with the other two parts of his trinity. Spock and McCoy are not themselves. None of the main three characters in this book are themselves. And I read this book originally when it first came out, and then I sort of forgot about it, and I reread it for this event, for BookTrek 2021. But I reread it for BookTrek 2021 with a little bit of trepidation, because in between when I read it and now, I've read a bunch of Christopher Bennett Star Trek novels that were very boring. Very overwritten, just very meandering. And this novel is not overwritten. This is actually very, very good. It's not meandering. Not much. You can see a little bit of where that might come from. It has the same signature lack as everything else that this author has written for Star Trek, which is that there is no drama. There's a plot, and there's even leaden attempts at cliffhangers, but there's no drama. You're never for a minute excited. It feels like you're reading a boardroom digest of a Star Trek adventure. And it's not as bad a feeling as you get in his other Star Trek novels, but it's still there in this book. But I enjoyed it anyway, and I was thinking, wow, that's great. Oh, BookTrek is paying off already. I'm getting all sorts of good experiences rereading a lot of Star Trek stuff that I hadn't gone to before. I'm intentionally staying away from Star Trek writers that I really like here, and going instead to either ones that I have an ambivalent reaction to or ones that I've forgotten completely. But although I enjoyed this novel, and although you will too if you're a Star Trek fan, especially if you like Star Trek the motion picture, I kind of do. I was pleased when I walked out of the theater. I saw it a few times, nowhere near as many times as I saw Star Trek 3, nowhere near as many times. I saw Star Trek the motion picture with an old friend of mine, a techie, very much along the lines of Mr. Scott. And we were almost killed by the theater. It was a packed theater. And it was all Star Trek fans and enthusiasts and whatnot. And we were in the theater, and my old friend, about, I don't know, I forget exactly when in the movie V'ger is mentioned. I think it's when Lieutenant Ilea, the reconstituted Lieutenant Ilea, comes back and mentions V'ger by name. But I think it wasn't a few seconds after that moment, I think it's about halfway through the movie, where my old friend said to me, and he was incapable of whispering, he was saying it just to me, but he didn't notice that there were a whole bunch of other people in the theater within earshot. He said, V'ger, I bet that's the old Voyager spacecraft that's just been transfigured somehow. We're lucky we got out of the theater alive. He wasn't trying to spoil anything. He was just a tech guy, that's all. So when the climax of the movie came, And you know, of course, spoilers here, but it's 50 years old now, so you're gonna know. Voyager, this gigantic probe that's coming to Earth, is a transfigured Voyager. At the heart of Voyager is the old Voyager spacecraft. Kirk actually has to finger some rust off the nameplate in order to read it. And when he reached that point in the movie, and we see that it's the old Voyager spacecraft, instead of smiles and expressions of glee on the part of the audience, everyone within a 15-seat radius of my friend and I just turned and coldly looked at us, because we had ruined the movie for them. He had ruined the movie for them. Even if I'd figured it out, I would have kept it to myself. And we saw Star Trek II together. And you all know how Star Trek II ends, and I was absolutely devastated. Devastated. Walked out of that movie thinking, what is Gene Roddenberry thinking? How on earth is this possible? And my friend, who was a very tech guy, was saying, what's the big deal? Characters live and die all the time. What's the big deal? And I was saying, it's a kind of a cold-blooded response to someone that a character you've known for a long time. And you're saying, well, it's just a character. It's no big deal. You still got the novels to read if you want to. And then we went to see Star Trek III together. And at the end of Star Trek III, my friend walked out devastated and wide-eyed and wobbly in the knees. What, how could that happen? What's going on here? And I got a chance to say, oh, it's just a ship. This is nuts and bolts. Anyway, if you like Star Trek the Motion Picture, and then you will love this novel. If you don't know Star Trek the Motion Picture and everything that came before it, the original series, all the episodes, you won't know what's going on here. Bennett does a terrible job of grounding or contextualizing anything in here. He knows he doesn't need to, so he doesn't bother. And as a result, I would have to say, much as I enjoyed this, it's a failure of a novel. It doesn't contain within it enough context to make sense of what's in it. You effectively know that the three main characters are very unsettled periods in their lives, but you very much don't know the context of why. This is a movie that is this is a novel that is an addendum to a movie. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that means necessarily it must fail just as a standalone novel on its own, and it does. So, on the one hand, I caution anybody who's reading Star Trek. One of the things that we're looking at here in BookTrek is, whether or not any of these Star Trek books are enjoyable on their own. And this one isn't. I don't imagine that BookTrek, the event, is appealing to many people who aren't already Star Trek fans, but you wouldn't want to read this if you weren't a Star Trek fan. But if you are, then this is the kind of book that I wish every one of the movies got, where somebody really intelligent and really good with the lore, really good with the background, and really familiar with the movie in question, wrote a follow-up that ties up all the loose ends from that movie. Every one of the movies could do that, and some of them, there are ones that do. Maybe we'll look at another one of those. One of my favorite Star Trek authors wrote such a book for Star Trek The Voyage Home. I just don't know if I want to go to any of my favorite authors. But one way or another, that's what we're gonna wrap up for today. This is Star Trek Ex Machina, and we're moving all around the time frames here. So we've seen late Star Trek novels, early Star Trek novels. Here's one right in the middle. Here's our heroes going back to the Enterprise. They're only freshly back on a newly designed Enterprise. Very enjoyable if you know that movie, if you know that time period. So I'm gonna wrap this up, but I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.